Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Jung. I'm the Executive Director of the California Asian Pacific American Bar Association, or Cal-APABA, and deep gratitude to the over 300 of you who've registered for today's commencement of the APA's versus Hate Conference. We're streaming live today via YouTube and Facebook, and you can submit your questions throughout the session in the chat box, and we'll take them from the panelists at the end. First, I'd like to express my deep appreciation to our sponsors, Procopio, the Wilkie Farr and Gallagher law firm, Cal-APABA's own president, Zathrina Perez, and we have a additional donation from the Oric law firm, which we appreciate very much. In addition, we would like to thank the partnership of our 27 community co-sponsors, and appreciate them spreading the word and giving us ideas and sharing their energy and enthusiasm for this conference. Only about 3 miles from my home in the Anza Vista neighborhood, a few weeks ago, an 85-year-old Thai grandfather named Visha Ratanapakdi was killed, and there was no apparent economic motivation for that killing. The grandfather was simply pushed to the ground, and he hit his head on the concrete, and he had a brain hemorrhage and passed away. And Mr. Ratanapakdi he's not alone. We all have seen several of these incidents on our social media feed, on the news, read them in the papers. There's a 64-year-old Vietnamese woman who was strong-arm robbed in San Jose, a 61-year-old Filipino man who was slashed in the face in New York, and there was a very recent attack near Lake Merritt in Oakland of a 75-year-old senior. We'll hear soon from Stop API Hate, but that organization has logged last year, in the 9 months beginning the pandemic, 2,800 hate incidents or hate crimes. The purpose of this conference is to learn from each other, discuss, and ultimately to inspire action. And we invite each of you to volunteer, to deliver pro bono legal services, to donate, to sponsor, and you can email us at calapaba@gmail.com if you're open to doing any of those things, joining us in this work. I'm very proud to introduce our moderator for this session, Lisa Mack. Lisa is a Cal-APABA officer. She's the president-elect of ABA Bay Area, and she's in her daytime job, when she's not doing volunteer work, she's a consumer and employee rights attorney at Minami, Tamaki. Lisa?
Thank you, Charles, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's my honor to introduce our panelists for today, starting with Manju Kulkarni. She is the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, also known as APCON, and co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, which you will hear more about during the panel today. Next, we have Aarti Kohli. She's the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus, based in San Francisco. And finally, we have Leonard Trinh. He is a Deputy District Attorney in the San Diego District Attorney's Office. Thank you all for being here with us. As Charles mentioned, for our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists today, please type them into the chat box, and we'll try to get to some of them during the Q&A portion of our program. I'd like to first turn to Manju. Can you start us off by highlighting some of the recent hate incidents targeting the APA community and the data that Stop AAPI Hate has collected about hate incidents starting from last year?
Definitely. First off, I just want to thank Cal-APABA and also Lisa and Charles for putting together this event. It's a real honor to be with you all and to be part of a panel with Aarti and Leonard, who are doing amazing work in the field to address these issues. If we can have my PowerPoint presentation go up. And I can start by sharing with you just some of what we've seen, next slide please, over the course of the last year. So essentially in February of 2020, we began to work on this issue at APCON because we saw that there were incidents that were happening in Southern California. Similarly, in the Bay Area, our partners saw incidents. So I just wanted to share a few with you. I'm not going to read through them, but you can see that they really run the gamut. So from the top left, a refusal of service, to the middle one of elderly parents being accosted and verbally harassed. The one on the right, a individual who's an essential healthcare worker. Underneath that, of attack of physical assault. The middle one at the bottom you may have heard of because it actually got some traction in terms of the news media and social media coverage, and actually the weaponization of Trump, as well as Trump-like comments made by a tech executive. And finally, the one on the very left-hand corner, that was the one that got us started on this issue, which was that a middle school child was physically attacked and verbally assaulted here in Los Angeles. And we began to work with the family and also with our elected officials to address what had happened. Next slide. And as I mentioned, this is a collaborative effort of Chinese for Affirmative Action, San Francisco State University with APCON. We have been working in AAPI spaces for a combined century. And I think with that, we have the trust of the community, like our partners on this webinar today. And we decided early on to make our form available in a dozen Asian languages so that those who are limited English proficient could also fill out a form. Next slide. I want to jump into the data of what we've seen. So this is through December of last year, and we actually will be issuing a new report on Tuesday, which will include additional reports involving 2020 as well as those in 2021. So we received close to almost 3,000 incidents over that 41-week period. The vast majority involved hate incidents and not hate crimes. So I know that there's been quite a bit of media attention on the ones that are, of course, the most heinous and egregious, the ones that Charles mentioned at the outset, but 90 to 95% do not involve an underlying criminal element at all. These are, of course, of the ones reported to us. All of them are self-reported, and incidents come from 50 states and the District of Columbia. It's not surprising that we get a significant number from California and New York, given that those two states have what are the highest populations of AAPIs in the country. We know that individuals who are targeted are often those who are seen as vulnerable, including women and also seniors. And so women sadly are reporting hate at almost 2.5 times the rate of men. Next slide. And then when we look at the actual types of discrimination, what you see here is that 60% or so involve verbal harassment or name calling. And we've given the data for the whole country and then also for California. That's followed by shunning or avoidance. And here we're not talking about what we do now, which is to sort of walk across the street to be safe from, other folks, give them their privacy and safety, but this is actual race-based shunning or avoidance. Then we have physical assaults. And then when you look at workplace discrimination, refusal of service, vandalism, being barred from transportation, altogether, those make up about 10%. And then you have roughly 10% that involves online discrimination as well. Next. And then when we, what's important to note is the site of these incidents. And what our data tells us is that 40% take place in businesses. So that affords a potential opportunity in terms of solutions, working with restaurants, grocery stores, obviously large employers, small businesses, to really get at some of these issues in terms of where incidents take place. We know too then that about 30% take place together at public streets, public parks, and public transit. The numbers for schools and universities are small, given that I think, we know that schools are not back in full force in person across the country. And even most university classes, I think, are taught virtually. Next slide. And then when we look at the targeted population, we see that a plurality do come from Chinese Americans, followed by Korean, Filipino, Vietnamese, and those who identify as Asian are either multiracial or identify more broadly. So this tells us that those who are perhaps perceived to be East Asian or perceived to be Chinese are also being targeted. Next slide. And so as I close, I just wanted to share two other points, which is we know this is having significant impact on our communities. We've observed a 155% increase in depression rates of Asian Americans across the country. We also know that they're experiencing high rates of unemployment due to small business closures, right behind unemployment rates for African Americans. And of course, policies matter as well. Under the Trump administration, there were a number of policies that were extremely problematic, including some bans on immigration, public charge, those related to racial sensitivity. And there even continue to be some under the Biden administration with the China initiative, which I know Advancing Justice has worked quite a bit on. Next slide. And so before I close, I just want to share with you what is our four-pronged strategy or approach. We are, of course, a reporting center, and we share our reports publicly and with policymakers. We also are seeking to provide resources as well as direct assistance. Some of the resources include, for example, a 50-state chart on our website of how one can file a complaint related to public accommodations discrimination in your state. And we also include relevant statutes as part of that chart. And then finally, the advocacy piece, which is working with our collaborative partners. I'm proud to say we're part of an Asian American National Table that is led by Aarti, to look at local, state, and federal laws and opportunities there are to perhaps create greater infrastructure, provide additional resources to communities and CBOs so that we can address what's going on now. We know that law enforcement is not going to be the only answer. And so we think it's really important to develop that infrastructure now when we have really the chance. So with that, I will end. You could go to the last slide in case folks want my email information. I appreciate the opportunity to share our data with you today.
Thank you, Manju, for sharing that data. And we have seen some of that data reported in various media outlets and on the news. But one criticism from the community was that the mainstream media was slow or delayed in starting to cover these recent hate incidents against the API community. Why do you all think that happened in terms of our visibility about the issue, and what can we do about that in the future?
Well, I can start. I mean, there's no question that, issues related to the model minority myth continue to perpetuate. And it's no surprise that it's in the media as well. And so part of that mythology is that our community doesn't have problems, that we are perhaps white adjacent, and so we don't experience discrimination in the same way as African American and Latinx communities. And while it's certainly true that unfortunately those communities have borne the brunt of issues around police violence, lack of education and job opportunities, and issues related to immigration enforcement, we too have our own set of problems. And we know that as a result of Trump's racist rhetoric, alongside other politicians and their use of language as well as policies against our communities, that we have these problems. And unfortunately, because of that mythology, I think it took media a long time to understand this issue and to begin to cover it.
Yeah, and I can just chime in here and say that one of the things you notice is the media who first started covering this were Asian American journalists. So, there is the barrier we have, in which is that, we need representation in a variety of different sectors. And you do see Asian American journalists who are continuing to really focus on this issue. And now a broader segment of folks are doing it as well. The other piece is that we needed more civic leaders to speak out. And that has happened over time, but it's the same thing. The civic and political leaders who were speaking out were Asian Americans. And lastly, I feel like social media has been is playing a very interesting role. You see that younger APIs are out there, being very public, talking about our identities, that we're here, that we should be visible, that our communities have needs. And I feel like culturally, that isn't something that the older generation has been comfortable with.
And I'll just chime in too. I can't understate the importance of what the work is that Manju is doing, because until you can quantify how bad a problem is, no one wants to pay attention to it. So the data that Stop API Hate is putting out is, I think, driving some of that now kind of late media coverage, because now that we can say this is how much API hate has increased in the last 15 months or 12 months since COVID started, I think now people are starting to pay attention, whereas when we didn't have that data before, no one really could say how bad that problem was. And so the work that they're doing is so important, because we have to label it as a problem, one, and then to quantify it for the public so that they care about it.
Absolutely. So we've looked at the data from Manju. Aarti, I'd like to now turn to you. Can you describe for us how the recent hate incidents fit into the larger social and historical context of racism and violence against the APA community?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we have a long history of racism and violence aimed towards Asian Americans in this country, going back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when you had the Chinese Exclusion Act and other Asian Exclusion Acts, as well as in California, the alien land laws, which were really targeting Japanese Americans from owning land. And then, a long period of history where we weren't even allowed to migrate to this country, followed by Japanese internment. And then when we had the economic crisis in the auto industry, we had, the terrible killing of Vincent Chin. I think for me personally, in terms of my career, I particularly remember what happened post 9/11 as a South Asian, the hate that was aimed at anybody perceived to be Muslim, including, Sikh Americans and other South Asians. And what was really troubling was that there was a rhetoric that permitted all of this. And we see this happening again. And about a year ago, when I started hearing about these incidents, I realized that, this was going to get worse before it was going to get better. Those of us who, were around post 9/11, we saw that. And so that's why I started this Asian American Leaders Table. It's a national table of Asian American advocates from across the country. And about a year ago, we started talking about how do we address this issue together, because it isn't just California and New York, as Manju explained. The reporting, I think, is more robust in those areas, but it's happening all over the country. And so what we really focused on is we needed to divide the issue up into 3 buckets. One is narrative, which is very important. And I totally, agree with you, Leonard. It's so important that there is a narrative that is defined by us, the communities that are being impacted by hate, and that our voices are being heard in the mainstream. And then the other piece of narrative that's really actually one of the more challenging pieces is communicating to our communities, because we have such a diversity of languages. As Manju showed, the Chinese community is disproportionately impacted, but so are other Asian communities. The other is policy. What are the policy interventions? How are we going to actually address the root cause of this systemic racism that we're seeing? And what are the policy interventions at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level? And the third is solidarity, because one of the challenges is that we are often divided as communities of color, and although there are white supremacists who are committing, part of this harassment and racism, you also have interracial violence. How do we handle that in this moment? On the one hand, we are, mourning the death of George Floyd. We're looking at anti-Blackness. We're supporting the movement for Black lives. On the other hand, our communities are experiencing. So how do we reconcile those 2 issues? And so it's very important that we do this work, starting with our communities, but we have to do it in partnership with other communities of color. So that's how we're approaching this. And these are part of the lessons learned, post 9/11. I think one quick additional comment I will make is that what we saw after 9/11 was not just the interpersonal violence, but also the state violence, which is surveillance coming from the government. Communities cast under suspicion because of their religious or ethnic identity. We have something similar going on. The Department of Justice has something called the China Initiative. They are going after particularly Chinese immigrant scientists. We've had local prosecutions of folks for so-called visa fraud because they didn't list every single affiliation they have with the Chinese government. And we are also at Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, we are also working on that issue, doing FOIAs, really trying to understand the depth and breadth of that particular problem. And so I just wanted to put that out there. There's like an additional piece to the interpersonal violence that we're talking about.
And opening it up to the entire panel, do any of you think there are any historical patterns in the hate-based incidents against our community? And is there anything that we can learn from those patterns?
Well, I think Aarti provided a number of the cases in which this has happened. And, the only point I want to make here is that we see the ways in which propaganda, sentiment that is flamed by policymakers and others is weaponized and utilized against our communities. So with the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, it was a number of years in which there were cartoons, there were other things in the mainstream media indicating that Chinese Americans were unsanitary, they lacked hygiene, they had unusual habits and dress. You see some of the same things around the virus itself. Excuse me. And we even saw that in the early 1900s with the South Asian American community, ways in which it was targeted. People often don't know that in addition to the yellow peril, there was something called the dusky peril. There are hordes of Hindus coming to the United States. That was a mainstream media outlet headline in 1907. And it took 10 years to get the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. But we know that white supremacists are relentless. And so I think we should be on the lookout and watch for what's going on now and how it's building to the type of policies that Aarti talked about.
Yeah, and let me just add, we are perpetual foreigners. It doesn't matter what generation you are in this country, and that's a challenge that whenever there is a foreign policy issue happening, when we're in conflict with another country, with particularly an Asian country, it's the impact is felt here. And we've had conversations with, we are in conversation with the White House as well as DOJ about this and about this rhetoric, top with the Trump administration, and that we aren't actually seeing a wildly different rhetoric around China. And so, there's one thing, you have to distinguish the Chinese government from Chinese Americans. And politicians have to understand the impacts of their words.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems when it comes to hate generally is that we paint with too broad of a brush other groups that we don't belong to. And one of the kind of common threads as I was listening to Aarti talk about the history of APA violence here is, at the root cause, I think it's fear and looking for someone to blame that's caused a lot of these state-sponsored violence, and then just other actual violence that's occurred through internment camps, and then what we're seeing now in COVID. And so, are there things that we can do? I think we can be better allies when we see other groups be targeted, and kind of expect that same allyship when we're targeted as well. But we have to speak up when it happens, and we can't wait until things get as bad as they are before we kind of stand up and try to draw attention to it.
So I wanted to switch gears to a different topic now. Leonard, can you talk about the existing structure of hate crime laws in California and how they might be applied in different situations?
Sure. So if we can go to my PowerPoint. California, we're fortunate here that we have some of the most expansive hate crimes laws in the country, really. And in California, a hate crime is defined as a criminal act that's committed in whole or in part because of one of the more following actual or perceived characteristics of the victim: disability, gender or gender identity, nationality, race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or association with a person or group with one or more of these actual or perceived characteristics. So a lengthy definition for what a hate crime is, but I'm going to break it down into its different component parts. Now, Manju talked a lot in her segment and provided some examples of hate incidents, and to kind of draw a distinction between a hate incident versus a hate crime. Hate incidents most often result in the use of some sort of slur or language that references one of these characteristics. So some of the examples, like go back to China that Manju had up, where people were being attacked because of the fact that they looked like they were or belonging to the APA API community, that would be a hate incident. If there's no threat of violence or no assault or battery or destruction of property, that's a hate incident. Still important to document, and I think AAPI is doing a great job documenting all of those hate incidents. But unless and until there's a threat of actual violence or actual violence or destruction of property, it doesn't cross over into a hate crime. And the reason for that is because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of speech, and that's applied to all of the states. So we cannot criminalize hate speech or hate incidents. There has to actually be some either physical harm, threat of harm, to bring it into the arena of a potential hate crime. In whole or in part, what that basically means is that there has to be a bias component. There has to be some evidence that the person who is committing the crime has a bias against another person because of their disability, their gender, their nationality, or any of the other listed characteristics that are defined in the penal code. That's generally a pretty low bar. If they are using slurs in the course of the commission of the crime, that's enough to make something a provable hate crime. So there has to be some evidence of bias. Moving on to the next component, actual or perceived. A lot of times our defendants get people's races wrong. I mean, if you look at the API community, and I'll use myself as an example, I'm Vietnamese, but I often get mistaken for almost every other type of Southeast Asian if people don't know what my name is or who I am. And so if they mistake me for a Chinese person and start saying, go back to China, even though I'm not, that doesn't protect them from potential prosecution for a hate crime. It's not a defense if they get my nationality wrong. The fact that they have that bias and have demonstrated that bias, that's enough to make that potential crime fall within the actual or perceived characteristics of our hate crimes laws. The last area I want to touch on, association with a person or group with one or more of these actual or perceived characteristics. What that essentially means is if you're out at a march in support of, for instance, Black Lives Matter, or you're at a march that denounces API hate, and you don't belong to the API community or you don't belong to the Black community, and someone attacks you for that association or that advocacy that you're doing on behalf of another organization, you fall within California's hate crimes laws and you're protected under California's hate crimes laws. What's the effect of calling something a hate crime in California? Generally, what it does is it just increases the punishment. Whatever the underlying crime is, it can increase that punishment, and that's up to the discretion of the judge. If we go to the next slide, we can kind of talk more specifically about race-based hate crimes. These are stats from 2019, and these are the hate crimes that are reported to law enforcement agencies. If you see more than half of the hate crimes that are reported in the state of California are race, ethnicity, or national origin based. And that stat's been pretty much true for the last 20, 25 years. About half of the hate crimes that are committed year after year in California are race-based. Religion and sexual orientation bounce back and forth as the number one or number two or number three. And we do see a small percentage that are covered gender-based hate crimes and disability as well. If we just focus on race, ethnicity, and national origin, and we go to the next slide, we can kind of see from 2019 what the breakdown is. The overwhelming number of race-based hate crimes are against our friends in the Black and African-American community. 45% in 2019, even though the Black and African-American share of the California population is about 9%, so a five-fold increase. Asian Pacific Islander was just a shade under 9, and I believe the latest census data has the API share of the population in California at around 15%. So we're a little bit underrepresented when it comes to targeting, but again, these numbers are from 2019, so they're pre-pandemic. I fully expect that number to be significantly higher in 2020 when they're reported later this year, and then also in 2021 as we continue to ride out the pandemic and ride out this wave of API hate that we've been seeing. So that's kind of the structure of California's hate crimes laws. Like I said, it is something that in our own county, in San Diego County, we have filed 3 hate crimes that were anti-API since the start of the pandemic last year. In 2019, we had 0. In 2018, we had 0. So we definitely have seen that increase as well within our own community.
Thanks, Leonard. So just to clarify, the data that you shared with us was hate crimes that were actually reported to law enforcement. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Those are reported to law enforcement, and then from law enforcement reported to the California Department of Justice. We know that those numbers are hate crimes are by their nature generally underreported anyway, but those are the numbers. And like I said, they've been pretty steady for the last 25 years as far as the percentage breakdown. So. Okay.
And do you have any data on the actual criminal prosecution of hate crimes that are reported to law enforcement?
Yeah, for anti-API hate crimes, they're a much smaller percentage. I want to say statewide, there's no more than 40 that have been filed in the last several years. But again, I anticipate 2020, there will be a much higher number than that.
And what have been some of the legislative or policy responses to address the rise of hate incidents against the Asian community?
I can start. We are supporting legislation by Assemblymember Bonta to AB 886, which would fund community-based organizations that facilitate culturally competent mental health services for victims of hate violence, and also funds restorative justice programs. And so one of the challenges right now is that, just from our talking to community-based partners, the victims feel very, ignored. And so, and even when things don't rise to the level of a crime, they are dealing with trauma, right? And so what do we have in place for the victims and for the community-based organizations who are, responsible and working with communities on the ground? They're very, very under-resourced. And so that's part of what we're looking to do, is make sure there are resources for that work. And restorative justice is another piece. I think in particular when perpetrators are youth and youth of color, we're talking, as I mentioned before, we're talking about ending mass incarceration. We're looking at criminal justice reforms. Do we want to really reinforce a system that is all about increasing punishment? Or do we want to get to the root causes of, why people have these beliefs, and how can we help them, acknowledge the harm that they're doing, because our communities absolutely deserve safety. But how can we shift them? Because just punishing people and locking them up for longer periods of time is not going to address the root cause of this violence. And so that is part of what we've been talking about in partnership with an amazing array of nonprofits who serve API communities in California.
Yeah, and I even though I'm a prosecutor, I wholeheartedly agree with what Aarti said. There's a perception that all that prosecutors care about is the punishment aspect of it, which there are some crimes that are so heinous that that's the primary focus. But there's another component that's also really important, and that's prevention. And in those cases where there are youthful offenders and we don't see a long and documented history of bias, those preventative tools, anti-bias training, restorative justice, bringing them to the table with the victim so they can hear directly how their actions impacted the victim, that actually can have a more profound effect on the offender than putting them in jail. We can put people in jail or in prison, but that's not going to solve all the problems. So we do look at those things on a case-by-case basis. For some people who have 20, 30 years of documented hate, incident and acting out violently, I would be less inclined to take a chance on them. But for youthful offenders, absolutely, that is something that we should look at, because ultimately we want them to be productive members of society, and we want them to be able to live with people of backgrounds different than them and not have recurring issues. So that is definitely important. There is another bill that is out there, AB 557, and it is a statewide hate crime hotline. San Diego actually started its own hate crime and hate incident reporting hotline back in April of last year. And so we're glad to see that there will be. I think New York State already has one as well. And so I think it's going to be modeled similarly after New York's, what the AG is doing there. And so I think that's great for information sharing purposes. Obviously, if any of these incidents are tied to white supremacist groups or anything like that, a statewide reporting agency that can distribute the information to address those issues is going to be the best option that we have.
Yeah, and then let me just jump in and say that we're also working with the API Legislative Caucus to resource a range of other programs that community-based organizations feel like, they would like to try. So some of the programs are like, for example, community ambassadors. Because here's the thing, a lot of our community folks don't actually want to call the police when things happen. They don't want to walk with the police. It's not, they're not comfortable. And so we really need to provide resources that actually meet their needs. So community-based ambassador programs are one of the things that folks want to do. As I mentioned before, mental health resources for survivors of violence, and funding for non-police mental health support. I mean, one of the, I don't know if you all have heard, but in Antioch, a young Filipino man was having a mental health crisis, and his family called the police. They came in and basically, he died because of the family feels it's because the police put a knee to his neck. And, it was the exact opposite outcome of what, was intended, right? You're calling the police for help, but the police actually show up and your loved one dies. And that's something that the Black community has been experiencing, for a really long time. And we have to recognize that law enforcement, increasing resources to law enforcement isn't the answer that, a lot of our community folks want. And so that's one of the difficult conversations we need to be having.
And on that note, Aarti, what are some community-based solutions and community organizing that's happened in response to this issue, and are those approaches working?
Yeah, I wish Manju had not, unfortunately she had another engagement, but I know that in LA, they've started, I guess, a crisis intervention hotline that's a partnership. It's called LA versus Hate. And it's a 211 number. And so it doesn't necessarily go to the police. And it's an opportunity for folks to report what's happening and get support as well. And I feel like that's a model I'm curious about. It started pretty recently, so I'm not sure if the impact, if there's been an evaluation of how good it is, but I've heard very good things about it. I think people are feeling like that is one model that we can potentially use. And I think, we're kind of dividing the work up into prevention and bridge building, which, Leonard, I totally agree with you. Prevention is really important, and that we really have to augment funding for children and youth, and as well as things like ethnic studies. We all need to know each other's history. And that's a really important, that starts when we're very young, right? And then arts and cultural program that encourages cross-community, cross-racial dialogues. Especially in California, we've got APIs are 15% of the population. We're a majority minority state. There's no excuse for us to not do these things. We also want resources for outreach, in language outreach. As I mentioned, language barriers are a big challenge for our community. And outreach on crisis interventions, violence prevention information, just all the things that we're talking about, people need to know how to get access to them. And then, there's the deep work of investing in our infrastructure, right? So we've got, pre-COVID, you had gentrification. We've got tenants, elderly Asian folks who were getting, kicked out of Chinatown, right? We've got people dealing with lack of access to decent employment, lack of access to even their employment benefits from EDD. So you've got all the other crises that are happening, both related to COVID and just to economic justice, right? And the long-term disinvestment in not only our low-income communities, but our neighbors, right? And people that we live with in other low-income communities. And so that you can't, the container for this is far more complex than we often talk about. And the solutions have to actually address that complexity.
Leonard, do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with everything that Aarti said, and I just want to highlight the educational component to our youth. It's unfortunate that when there are cuts to be made, ethnic studies, arts, those kinds of things are oftentimes the first things that are cut. But when you look at it in the general context of where hate is moving in this country, it's the worst place to make cuts. When we look at some of these white supremacist groups that are in existence now, they're recruiting elementary school, middle school, high school, college-age kids. And so if we're not combating the message that's being sent to those kids with ones of acceptance, diversity, inclusion, that's going to be a real problem, because in the next several years, they're going to start adopting a lot of those beliefs, buying into the fears that they're losing power to minorities, or that their educational or romantic relationships are going to be lost to people who are of a lesser quality than them. That has to be combated with a message that says, no, that's not true. And so I think that component of it is so important. And we need to really do more when it comes to having those programs available to our youth.
Great, thank you. So we'll now move into the Q&A portion of the program. Thank you to everyone who submitted a question for our panelists. And unfortunately, Manju had to drop off a bit early. But if you have any specific questions for her, feel free to contact her. We have one question, I think, Leonard, you can answer. When is a hate incident also a hate crime?
Yeah, so all hate crimes are hate incidents, but not all hate incidents are hate crimes. So like we mentioned before, if someone's spouting off horrific racial slurs or homophobic slurs or anti-Semitic slurs, but there's no threat of violence, meaning, like they don't say something like, I'm going to kick your butt, or, whatever, I'm going to kill you, something like that. That's a hate incident. In San Diego, we had a string of hate incidents that happened in our East County region. One where a guy went to a grocery store wearing the KKK hood right at the start of the pandemic, but he didn't threaten anyone, he didn't intimidate anyone. That's pretty classic hate incident, but not a hate crime. So those kinds of things, the use of the slurs, the put downs based on race, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, gender, those are hate incidents, but it's not until you make a threat to someone or you actually physically assault or damage property that it crosses over into a hate crime.
Can I just say something about
Sure.
hate crimes? Yeah, and I saw that there was a question about Gascon as well related to this. So we've had some really, we've had to think really deeply about the whole concept of hate crimes, because we were historically an organization, that really fought for them. And part of it is, I think, the reason that people wanted this is the community wants a recognition that they're being targeted, right? The community wants to know that there is an understanding that there is racial animus, right? That's happening. And absolutely, the community deserves validation for and recognition and safety. The challenge is we work on criminal justice reform, right? And we are a country out of industrialized countries that locks up the most people for the longest periods of times. Often our sentences are twice or more than other countries, right? And so what does a hate crime enhancement do? It increases the length of a sentence that is probably already incredibly long and, longer than what other countries do. So how do we reconcile this? This is a real challenge, right? And I think for us, we've had to make that difficult decision as an organization that is working on criminal justice reform, as working in allyship with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that enhancements aren't necessarily the answer. That's just a longer punishment to it. But what we want is some level of recognition of the harm to our communities. And that's the part that I think we all have to work together to talk about. How do we get that recognition? And it's not just for API communities. I know for when Gascon in LA said that he wasn't going to do enhancements, the LGBTQ community was very much concerned and up in arms. But I think we have to, I recognize that desire and anger. And some of it is, some folks really feel they want retribution and punishment. That's okay. But I mean, for them, but like that isn't, those aren't the values that we have as a social justice organization. That's been, the first API civil rights, Pan-Asian civil rights organization in this country. We know that we have to look at this issue systemically, not just for our communities, for other communities of color. And I think one question I have is, anecdotally, I know that hate crimes laws are often used against youth of color. And I don't know, Leonard, if you have data on that, but, that's the other piece. I think we have this perception that the hate crime law is, prosecuting some, like 50-year-old KKK white supremacist, and that's not necessarily the case. And so, yeah, I just wanted to add those things.
Yeah, I mean, Aarti's right in summarizing the function of hate crimes laws. There are, when Gascon came into office in the LAD's office, he initially said, I will not charge any enhancements or allegations, which essentially wiped out all of the hate crimes laws, which caused the LGBTQ community to be really upset, because that was something that was important to them. If they're being targeted for their sexuality or sexual orientation, they wanted that protection. Judges in California have the discretion to strike the punishment on hate crimes allegations. It was kind of an interesting thing written in the penal code when hate crimes laws were passed, that if judges wanted to strike the punishment, they had to state reasons on the record why they were doing that. And in the culture that we've kind of found ourselves in the last 3 years, with the pretty dramatic rise in hate crimes, judges were really reluctant to do that. At least in San Diego County, I've never had a judge strike it when it was discretionary to them. And so, it is sort of this wave of right now we really want to attack the problem, and so I think people are hesitant to maybe label it but not punish. But we might get there. I can tell you for me, in some of the cases that I've had where, the punishment and the hate crime allegation adds so much time, I'll offer a misdemeanor hate crime that doesn't really do anything, but it still keeps it as a label of a hate crime. I've offered that as well when I think we need to label this for what it is, but I don't want to add the additional time to the sentence because the sentence is already enough the way that it is.
And we did.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we also have to look at what happens to folks when they go to prison. A lot of times in prison, their folks' racial biases are reinforced. In many prisons, people are separated by race. So, I saw some questions about, victims having access to justice. Obviously, we are victim-centered. And so we do, when we work with victims, we are obviously listening to what they want. But at the same time, our job is to look at systems and to really get at the root of these problems. And so, sending a kid who committed a hate crime to prison, where then their bias is then reinforced, and then they come out and they might do it again. Like, is that really the answer? And I think we need to have much better solutions.
Thank you both. And we will definitely be discussing more of these issues in depth in the upcoming panels in our series. There was another question. We did talk a little bit about the anti-Chinese, anti-China sentiment. There's a question about, is there a compounding effect that the pandemic originated in the PRC, which is portrayed as a strategic adversary by the US, as opposed to having originated in Hong Kong or Taiwan or Singapore?
I mean, I would say yes, because Trump, part of his rhetoric around the PRC, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can tell you from the cases that we've seen and what Manju talked about, the weaponization of Trump, that's come up in the cases that I've had. So there definitely is a direct relationship between what's being said in the national discourse and then what's being parroted again when these crimes are being committed, unfortunately.
And I'll just do one last question. It's about Penal Code 422.6. Not being an enhancement, but rather defining a separate crime of violation of a person's civil rights. Does the criminal justice reform argument also apply equally to this section? Leonard, do you want to answer that briefly?
I would suspect if the question was directed at Aarti, she would be okay with with that section. And that's the misdemeanor code section that I was referring to, that if I still wanted to characterize it, because 422.6 still is in California considered a hate crime. If I have a felony, let's say assault with a deadly weapon, and I still want it to be a hate crime, I will offer the 422.6 as opposed to the felony allegation that calls it a hate crime. And that doesn't add as much time at all to the maximum sentence. The 422.6, for misdemeanors at least, they usually don't add any time.
So we are just about out of time. I'd like to thank our panelists again for their time and insight today on this important discussion. And thank you to all of you who tuned in today. Our second panel series in this conference will be next Thursday at noon, where we'll be discussing the underlying racial issues and conflicts and tensions surrounding these hate incidents. We've started to talk about that discussion a little bit today, but we'll have a more in-depth discussion about that. If you've already registered for our conference, you do not need to register again. You will automatically receive a Zoom link to the next panel. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, thank you and take care.